So my parents had two great passions. One was Christian faith and the other was science. And by passion, I of course mean this in the British sense, not as a kind of overexcitement, but as a deep commitment, often shown by what they actually did rather than what they actually said. But certainly both their passions rubbed off me as a young boy. My mother, in fact, was one of the first women to study physiology at Oxford in the early 1930s. Physiology was very much a man's world in those days. In fact, I think there were only two women in her year amongst a sea of hundreds of men. And both those women, including my mother, were Christians. So my mother taught physiology for much of her life as she raised us four children. My father was a businessman, not a scientist, but his father had been a doctor and in fact had served in the British Navy as a doctor during the last years of the First World War. In 1918, last year of the war, just after the war, he was on a ship carrying American soldiers back to New York. And it was the time of the great flu pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu. And he caught it and he died in New York. And so he's buried in a cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. But I inherited his microscope and used to spend many happy hours as a boy looking at those wonderful wriggly creatures from the garden pond down the microscope. And I think a passion for science is probably caught as well as taught. I became a Christian myself at the age of 13. So I grew up with my science and my faith naturally wedded together as partners. At no stage would I ever have thought of them as being in some kind of conflict. Obviously, my parents believed in evolution, like all the other Christians I knew. And when I eventually went to Oxford to study biochemistry for 4 years, all I experienced there just served to reinforce that kind of partnership between science and faith. So it wasn't really until later on I started meeting people who actually thought there was some kind of conflict between science and religion, an idea that I thought was quite weird. I did my PhD in the Institute of Psychiatry in London, and I did it in neurochemistry, studying the biochemistry of the brain. But then I began to discover some people who actually thought that science had all the answers or scientific descriptions were the only ones that counted. And I thought, again, that was a bit silly, but it did make me start really thinking about my science, my faith, and that's, of course, a good thing. And I have to say that since then, the main idea that's made most sense to me in thinking about the relationship between science and faith is that of complementarity. Faith and science are looking out of two different windows, if you like, with two different perspectives on the same reality. And the questions they ask and the answers they find are complementary to each other. There are many ways of looking at the world, and there are many types of human knowledge. There's simply no necessary contradiction between them. And I just think we need to take them all very seriously.